Thanks, everyone, for joining us, the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to welcome back on the program Chip Gibbons, who's a journalist, researcher, and policy director of Defending Rights and Dissent. And he's currently working on a book on the history of FBI political surveillance for Verso Books. Chip, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you. And I suspect the audience is starting to believe the book is never coming, but I can promise them that I did, in fact, turn in the first 163 pages to the publisher earlier, whatever month when this broadcasts. I don't know when this actually broadcasts, but
congrats.
Thank you.
And I look forward to it because that's
finish it. So only the first 163 pages, which
I mean, I feel like you could write 80,000 pages on that, but
I'm working on it, but I don't think that's what Verse wants to hear.
No. And brevity is not my strong point either, but I wanted to talk to you about a lot of the work that you do, not least of all the work that has to do with what's going on in Gaza right now. We're recording this on Tuesday, March 25th, so our listeners know. And just yesterday, Israel deliberately targeted and murdered two more journalists, Hossam Shabbat and Mohammed Mansour. Mohammed died in his home as it was targeted by a strike. Less than an hour later, Hossam was killed while traveling on a horse cart in Jabalia, northern Gaza. And these represent just the latest in targeted killings of Palestinian journalists in Gaza. As of today, Israel has murdered at least 208 Palestinian journalists and media workers since October 2023. And already before the ceasefire, more journalists have been killed in Gaza than in any war in modern history, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists' data. And I just wanted to briefly share something that Hossam posted back in June of last year, because I think it's very pertinent to our conversation today. He posted, quote, "Language is important. Language makes genocide justifiable. A reason why we are still being bombed after 243 days is because of the New York Times and most Western media. They continue to spread misinformation and are willing to jump many hoops instead of stating that Israel is committing genocide or that Israel is killing Palestinians daily. The New York Times is complicit in this genocide. The New York Times has the blood of 15,000 Palestinian children on their hands." End quote. So, Chip, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this remarkable failure of so-called Western media to not only report on what's actually happening in Gaza, but also to even show a minimal amount of concern in the targeted killings of their supposed colleagues, although I hesitate to call these people journalists as they're not nearly on the same level as journalists in Gaza. What's the root of these failures?
Well, every year they have the White House press correspondents dinner. I'm sure you look forward to it very much, Eleanor. Do you get an invitation? We probably, neither you nor I get an invitation, but last year, the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate called for a boycott of the dinner, and there were big protests outside, mostly from Palestine supporters. A few WikiLeaks, this was when Julian Assange was still indicted, and I went just to check it out as a journalist and watch what was going on. And the protesters put on the ground, the Palestinian press jackets with the names of journalists who had been assassinated by the Israelis. And they laid them on the ground. And I watched an American journalist in a tuxedo step on the names of a dead Palestinian journalist, multiple Palestinian journalists, to walk into the White House press correspondent dinner. And I think that really sums up the situation we're in. There is a shocking apathy towards their Palestinian colleagues. And there is also, I think, a real difference between what the Palestinian journalists do and what the New York Times does. The New York Times has always laundered propaganda for the Israelis. One of the things I actually talk about in the part of my book that I just turned in is how Judith Miller went to Israel to essentially, Judith Miller was later famous for the Iraq War propaganda, but in the early 90s, Israel deported a bunch of Palestinians from Gaza to Lebanon, and the U.S. did not veto the resolution condemning it at the Security Council. And Israel started claiming Hamas was based out of the U.S. And the FBI, the CIA, everyone rejected this. They said it was Israel retaliation for us for not vetoing the resolution. And Judith Miller has in her book, I think it's called 99 Names for God, I believed the Israelis, not the FBI, not the CIA. And she went to Israel and witnessed the interrogation of an American citizen who was almost certainly tortured. She decided he wasn't tortured and feeds questions to the IDF. And then she runs on the front page of the New York Times. Israel says Arab Americans fund terrorism, with no mention at the time that she had participated in the interrogation if someone was tortured. So she basically just laundered this sort of Israeli claim. And this was in 1993. And I hate to say it, but in 2023, they were doing the same thing. These articles like Screams Without Words. Obviously sexual assault is a horrific crime. It is very common in war. There is, no side that doesn't, engage in war crimes, and that should be condemned no matter who does it. But like that article repeated unverified and likely unproven claims. How many times do we hear claims about, beheaded babies that didn't exist? Meanwhile, every night we see images coming out of Gaza actually of babies beheaded, but they never get the same attention. Or there's a lot of controversy over the fact that, Israel, killed some of its own people on October 7th. I think that's pretty well established. And there was one story I was reading about an IDF commander who was outside a home on the kibbutz where the Israelis had shelled it. And he reported that Hamas had committed all these atrocities and that didn't happen. And the media reported it. And like, if you're a journalist or you're standing outside a house that is clearly the victim of heavy artillery fire, but what side did that, which is not to justify everything Hamas has done. There's no excuse for targeting civilians. They've clearly targeted civilians. I condemn the killing of all civilians. I want peace and equality and all these great things. But if you're standing outside a house that has been struck by heavy artillery fire, who has, that weapon and who doesn't. So the media has just been utterly subservient in laundering Israeli propaganda claims. It has relentlessly demonized the Palestinian people in order to facilitate a genocide, and then it has whitewashed the actual violence that has taken place. And there's no better point of comparison than the now disproven story about beheaded babies versus the actual images of beheaded babies we see. How many times have you heard about the beheaded babies that didn't happen? And you and I are on social media, we're in independent media, but if you just watched mainstream media, would you ever know about the beheaded babies of Gaza that we see constantly?
No, not at all. And I mean, of course, it's a very stark contrast of which lives matter and which lives don't, which is inextricably tied to the U.S. empire's relationship with its colony of Israel. And at the same time here at home, and I always like to say that imperialism is a home game. Like, nobody acts like, Rambo outside and comes home and acts like Mr. Rogers. So the brutality with which the United States works with people like Israel or entities like Israel is, of course, going to track here at home. And here we're seeing an escalation in the targeting of intellectuals at universities for speaking up in support of Palestine, not least of all the kidnapping and caging of Columbia student Mahmoud Khalil, which you've recently written about as well. But he's just one example. There are several others, including a Brown University assistant professor who was deported despite a judge's orders, a Georgetown researcher who is now being held, I believe, in the same Louisiana jail as Mahmoud. And I'd like to talk about your recent article for Jacobin in a minute, Chip. But first,
Sure.
I want to talk a little bit about what is clearly a collaboration between ICE and our local Gestapo and institutions of higher learning, and what that means not only for basic rights to free speech, but also what that means for these places that are supposed to be guiding lights for open debate and speech.
Well, you're seeing a multi-level cooperation. You have private McCarthyite Zionist groups like Batar, who have been very active in promoting that certain students are terrorists, and they've bragged about sending deportation list to Trump administration. And you have this long history in this country of private vigilantes in sort of any McCarthyite repression. And you have a particular history of it around Israel, where groups like the ADL, or the awful David Horowitz's Front Page Magazine, if anyone even remembers that anymore, but have sent stuff to the government that has been used to facilitate FBI investigations, or in this case, ICE prosecutions. In addition to sort of ICE and the private network, you have these committees in Congress. You have an Education and Workforce Committee, which has basically just become the new House Un-American Activities Committee, which has had these ridiculous hearings, sort of demonizing college professors and trying to get them to crack down on their students. And of course, the worst example is Columbia. I mean, the Columbia president bragged to the committee about reporting her students to the FBI for having a webinar, which I filed a FOIA request about, and the FBI told me they had no records on. So either the FBI is lying or the Columbia president lied to Congress. I think I know which one is lying, but please no one's yes, yeah. But she said, after they had this webinar on this date with these speakers with this title, I've reported to the FBI, and being myself, I immediately filed a Freedom of Information Act request, and the FBI was like, never heard of it. So you have these committees that are encouraging members of Congress. In DC, it's one of the worst examples, because we're not a state here in DC, and our mayor decided that the police could not be used to break up the local student encampment, which was at George Washington University, I believe. It was it George Washington or George? It was at George Washington. And unless they were violent. And the same committee sent her all these letters. They were calling her to testify. And on the day she was supposed to testify, the police went in and broke up the encampment and arrested the students. And she didn't have to go to before Congress. Muriel Bowser, a real profile in courage. She's the same mayor who is, of course, ripping up the Black Lives Matter plaza. But, I would tell you she never had good relations with Black Lives Matter in DC. That was, yes, about Muriel Bowser, but many of the listeners might not. So you have this sort of, these congressional committees that are whipping this up in the way HUAC did. You have state and local law enforcement like ICE. I'm sure the FBI is involved. Joe Biden's director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, who was a torture supporter, claimed that Iran was encouraging the protest. So, and then you have these universities who are trying to appease this. And Columbia is a great example of the failure of appeasement, right? They called the cops to beat up their own students. And the right-wing McCarthyites in Congress and the Israeli lobby McCarthyite network, whatever you want to call it, they're still beating up on them. And now they have this sort of ransom note where they're going to lose $400 million in funds unless they adopt the IHR, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Death Research Anti-Semitism, if they don't put this department in receivership, if they don't change their discipline policy in this way, if they don't give the cops arrest powers. Like, it's pretty stark what's going on here. So you have this interplay between private McCarthyites, congressional committees, law enforcement, and probably intelligence agencies and universities, which is exactly the interplay you saw during the second Red Scare. Like, it is cut and paste.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that a little bit more, because you recently wrote an article for Jacobin titled "Crushing Dissent Through Immigration Law," and it lays out an historical account of how dyed-in-the-wool American these moves really are. And I just want to share one quote. You write, quote, "And in seeking to deport Khalil," that's Mahmoud Khalil, "the Trump administration is not just using an old law, but an old tactic. The abuse of immigration law to silence political speech has a long history in the U.S., From the Pommel raids to the present, it has often been the weapon of choice for America's political police," end quote. So, Chip, could you walk us through some of this history and give us an idea of how what we're seeing now is different, if in fact you feel that it is?
It's an extremely old history. I mean, the Alien Enemies Act, which is being used in a different context, actually goes back to John Adams and was part of the Alien Seditions Act, which was a restriction on democracy at home and free speech at home and censorship of newspapers that also included a restriction on immigrants' rights. And again, when we see these crackdowns on free speech, including more recently in the 20th century, they oftentimes include an abuse of immigration law. The quintessential example of this is the Palmer raids. This is how Hoover got his start as a political police, although he always denied his role in it because it was a public relations disaster. It's sort of paradoxical. It makes Hoover the celebrity anti-radical, but it's not something he wants to be associated with in the long run. But he was head of an intelligence division within what is now the FBI, tasked with tracking radicals. There was no federal law making a crime to be a communist or an anarchist, but there were immigration laws that made it deportable to be so. And Hoover also believed that in immigration process, you didn't have constitutional rights. So the FBI could do what they want. And at this time, immigration control is under the Department of Labor. That's no longer the case, obviously. It hasn't been since like 1940. But Hoover basically takes over the Department of Labor immigration process and starts using immigration law to go after radicals. First, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, and Emma Goldman is actually denaturalized. And then they have these raids called the Palmer raids, first on the Union of Russian Workers, then on the various communist parties. There were multiple communist parties because all of the communists couldn't get along and be in one party. Very surprising, I'm sure. You're shocked that people, we have to have two communist parties because they all can't get along. Who would have guessed? And they use this sort of anti-anarchist immigration law to facilitate the arrest of upwards of 10,000 people. And they had warrants for only several hundred, but they would come to the headquarters of the political parties or the unions and just arrest everyone. And they, seized over almost 10,000 people. They liked the fact that with immigration law, they could be detained indefinitely. They liked the fact that there were loose procedures. And this goes on until eventually, I think his name was William Post, becomes the Secretary of Labor, and he actually has the say then on who is deported or not, and he rejects the overwhelming majority of requests for deportation orders from Hoover, and Hoover then becomes convinced he might be a secret IWW member, right? Because if you don't agree with Hoover, you're either a communist or an anarchist or a foreigner or this or that. It's pretty basic playbook, and this is 1919, 1920, and it backfires. Hoover has his intelligence powers taken away in 1924, but then in the run-up to World War II, people are concerned about like Nazi saboteurs and Nazi spies, and Hoover makes this point that, well, there were all these civil liberties abuses during World War I, which he did, right? But he doesn't tell that part of the story. If we don't have a professional like me handling it, they'll happen again. So they let him restart the General Intelligence Division. And there's this, I don't want to go too deep in the weeds here, but there's like this order giving them the power to go after like sabotage, spies, and stuff like that. And Hoover both claims he needs to like do preventative intelligence, see who might be a saboteur, who might be a spy. And you can guess they're all communists and leftists. And
they're like anti-war people too, right?
Yeah. And then he claims he also has the right to investigate Americans for subversive activities. And this continues to like 1973. And I get it. At the same time they're doing this, Hoover is once again very involved in an immigration proceeding, this time against Harry Bridges, who's an Australian labor organizer who successfully shuts down the West Coast ports and wins recognition for the ILWU. During the strike, the police shoot several of the workers, and there's actually a general strike in San Francisco. And the response is just ballistic. Shipping magnates and private McCarthyites and whatnot, we wouldn't have called them McCarthyites, I think it was the 30s, they want them deported. And this eventually creates this sort of sane mania. And eventually, in the 40s, this goes on for almost 17 years, he finds these listing devices in his hotel room, I think. And the Attorney General of the United States has to come out and admit that Hoover has been authorized to wiretap people. So again, you have an immigration enforcement that's very much either pre-configures or is tied to a greater expansion of U.S. domestic surveillance. So as I argue in the article, there's a degree of nativism here, no doubt. But the people who want to purge this country of politically undesirable speech, they're not limiting their sights to the foreign-born. If you think this is just an immigrant rights thing that has nothing to do with U.S. citizens, you're completely wrong. already the Trump administration is talking about whether or not Colombia violated anti-terrorism laws. And and this before there was Mahmoud Khalil, the Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, and Bush 2 administrations spent almost 20 years trying to deport 8 pro-Palestinian activists in Los Angeles. And in the course of the LA8 deportation, they start off with, well, immigrants don't have rights, and they end up, with Americans don't have rights, right? If you engage in free speech and we call it material support for terrorism, that's not protected by the First Amendment. And they passed these laws in the 90s, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which includes these horrible anti-immigration provisions, but they also criminalize speech that everyone thought was protected before. If you engage in coordinated political activity with a group that's considered terrorist by the State Department, or you send them humanitarian aid, even if these actions would otherwise be lawful, or in some cases protected by the First Amendment, these become material support for a foreign terrorist organization, a very serious felony I assure you you don't want to commit or be prosecuted for. So we see these attacks on immigrants, Pomeroy's, Bridges, Los Angeles 8, always coinciding with larger expansions of domestic surveillance, larger expansions of the national security state at home, and larger restrictions on free speech, whether it's communism or terrorism. And with the LA case, I have to note, when they first tried to deport them under Reagan, the local newspaper read War on Terror hits home, or War on Terror comes to LA. But the law they were using made it a deportable offense to belong to an organization that advocated world communism, or the doctrine of world communism. And that law was repealed at the end of the Cold War. By the end of this case, they're trying to deport them under the Patriot Act. So you see this transition from an anti-communist or counter-subversive framework to a counter-terrorist framework, and lo and behold, the targets are the same, the goals are the same, the results are the same. It's almost like the entire modern fixation on terrorism is an attempt to rebrand McCarthyism, which people were saying throughout the Reagan years. It goes way back before 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, it really does highlight like the goldfishness of the American people, and of course the attempt to ensure that we are goldfish by the ruling class, that we don't recognize. I mean, just like what you were talking about with Hoover, like that nobody bothered to check, like, hey, is this the guy he's saying that, but isn't he the guy that did the thing that he said that he didn't want to happen?
Well, it was hugely controversial when he comes back. There's a member of Congress, Vito Marcantonio, the National Lawyers Guild, and other people who draw this connection. But even into the 50s, one of the greatest pieces of evidence you were a secret communist was that you said Hoover did the Palmer raids. There's a document I have from I think the 50s where they're really angry at the Nation magazine. They have all these examples of the Communist Party line, the Nation magazine. The first example is Hoover was responsible for the Palmer raids. So that's just a fact.
Right. So you're a communist if you say Hoover did the Palmer raids, and you're an anti-Semitic terrorist if you say that Israel is committing a genocide.
Yes. Yeah.
There's clearly that red thread.
Probably a communist in the second case too. We're not. I mean, we still hear some of that rhetoric.
Oh, absolutely. Those, I mean, communist, anarchists, even socialists are just those. They're off the map where there be monsters. And with the time we have left, I would like to talk about other attacks on free speech that we've seen that are, of course, connected to what we're talking about here. And also how there is a red thread of this throughout the history of the U.S. Reporters Without Borders released a report in February that cataloged attacks on First Amendment rights, including banning the AP from official White House events, limiting the access of so-called unfriendly outlets to the administration's press pool events, publicly insulting journalists that Trump and Musk disagree with and calling for their removal, calling for prison sentences for 60-Minute staff who disagree with Musk policies. I mean, I'm laughing because it's so absurd that I can either laugh or cry, and I don't feel like crying right now. Suing outlets, including the Pulitzer Center and CBS, for unfavorable coverage, limiting access to government information vis-a-vis deleting thousands of pages from the sites of agencies such as the CDC and the DOJ. And so what I'm talking about here and what Reporters Without Borders is talking about is clearly no walk in the park. But kind of jumping off of our last question, First Amendment rights have always been tenuous at best in this land of the free. I mean, Assange is perhaps the biggest, most recent example, but there have been many assaults, sometimes literal, on press and journalists in this country. How do you feel that these recent attacks on freedom of the press and freedom of the speech, how do those compare with the history of those attacks? And do you feel that what we're dealing with now is somehow different or uniquely terrible?
It's bad. It's not good. Is it different? I mean, political repression is different from time to time, right? I mean, there's similarities, but there's specificity to that historical period. The one thing about Trump's attacks on the press is they're so personalized, right? It's not like we're a capitalist country, we have to get the communist, or we war with Vietnam, we have to get the SDS. It's, you did this really petty story on 60 Minutes. It's not that bad, and I have to come get you, right? The pettiness of Trump and the personalization of this is reminiscent of the period of the Nixon administration where Hoover said, no, I don't think we should do this, right, where Hoover got off the boat. And it reminds me a bit of that. Although, of course, Hoover was doing all kinds of abusive things far worse than Nixon, but he just had a grandiose vision of national security versus like, my election. And that's apparently better. I mean, is that better? Is that worse? I don't know. You can make a case either way. It is a really dark time, and I don't think we should downplay it. It is a little bit difficult at times listening to people talk about these sort of mean names Trump calls the mainstream media without mentioning the assassinations our government funds of Palestinian journalists, or the fact that Julian Assange, had to plead guilty to journalism, as our friend Kevin Gostola correctly titled his book in advance, Guilty of Journalism. And that doesn't make these attacks not important, but it does, again, it highlights some of the bad priorities in the mainstream media. But when it comes to stuff like these slap suits with people who are settling or threats to imprison people, we should take them very seriously. Unfortunately, thanks to the Julian Assange prosecution, they have a perfect way to go after journalists. And I want to say that Assange was a journalist. One of the criticisms that groups would make, like, oh, he's not a journalist, but they could do this to journalists. And it's like, well, the reason they could do this to journalists is because he was a journalist. And I think we should have all been a little bit more outspoken about that one. And I think a lot of the cowardice and lack of solidarity around Assange, around the Palestinian journalists, could come back to bite the mainstream media. And that doesn't mean they deserve what's coming, or we should help Trump burn the First Amendment or what's left of it. No, we shouldn't. But I do think when we're done with this period and we all survive, if we all survive, we should have some harsh words for some people who should have done a lot more, a lot sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes to like who gets to be called a journalist, recently when we saw Sam Husseini being dragged out of Blinken's last press conference, the so-called journalists that were sitting in the room said nothing to come to his aid, and later outlets called him a heckler and never referred to him as a journalist. So the way that that's framed, of course, is like, oh, this random heckler that somehow got into this press briefing got dragged out. Like,
I'm not going to give names, but I was on and some of the big press freedom groups, like I think Committee to Protect Journalists, obviously Defending Rights and Dissent, and Freedom of the Press Foundation did condemn what happened. But I was on a conversation with some people from some big press freedom world, like, is Sam really a journalist, or is he more of an activist? And my response was, well, the State Department credentialed him for the press conference as a member of the press, and then the police came and took him away. I think whatever you think of Sam in general, right, for the purposes of being a credentialed member of the press pool at the press briefing, and someone say, well, anyone can just wander into this briefing. So are you sure he's credentialed? I'm like, I almost did the thing I'm not supposed to do and use bad language. It's like, what are you talking about, right? Apparently I could just wander into the press pool and yell at Anthony Blinken. Did you know you could do this?
I mean, I wish you could.
I wouldn't be doing this. I wouldn't be doing it. But I'm pretty sure there's a credentialing process.
Wow.
No, and I actually texted Sam, like, when he was being processed, being like, hey, Sam, can you just confirm He was out. He wasn't arrested. He was just detained. But I texted him today, like, hey, Sam, can you confirm you had press credentials so I could go to these press freedom? Like, hey, guys, not an activist today, wearing his press badge.
Well, and it also suggests that you can't be an activist and a journalist. Like, I very much am transparent about the fact that I am an activist and a journalist, because guess what? There's no such thing as objective journalism. So the idea that you can't be both is based on this fallacy that there is some kind of objective journalism that you can practice. And supposedly it's the New York Times and CBS and CNN who practice this objective journalism. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, Sam might identify as an activist. Also, that doesn't mean he can't be a journalist. They're not mutually exclusive.
That was the other thing I said to this person, because they know me quite well. I said, I'm policy director, Defending Rights and Dissent, a free expression organization. When I was in London for the Assange hearing, I was wearing a Jacobin press badge and I had press credentials. I really would hope if the London police had dragged me out of the courtroom, you would have said something on my behalf. Who knows what would have happened? That thankfully did not happen. And, objective journalism, Eleanor, that is when you repeat what the Pentagon or the Israelis say without questioning it. When you question it, that's activism.
There you go. Well, then
both sides, like, well, the Pentagon says, the Palestinians say, that's activism.
Yep.
The only form of objectivity is repeating, don't even rewrite, just repeat, regurgitate the Pentagon press releases.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else is activism, and that's very bad.
It is. It's very, very bad.
Terrible. Terrible.
Yes. And I want all of the FBI and NSA people listening to this to know that I think that that's very bad. Chip, thank you so much. What?
I'm sure they're persuaded.
I'm sure my little 2-second spiel there did a lot. Thank you so much, Chip, for taking the time to sit down with us once again and contextualizing this very important history. We talk about this a lot on Project Censored. It's very important to not be goldfish historically, because you see this, if it doesn't rhyme, it echoes. And so it's very important to recognize that. You can follow Chip and his work over at Defending Rights and Dissent, and look out for that book that will be coming soon. Thanks so much, Chip, for hanging out with us.
All 2026.
Sweet. I hope we're all still here.
If I actually finish it, we might not all still be here. Yes. If I finish on time, it'll be out in fall 2026.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chip, for taking the time. Right.